Kia ora everybody, this video is to guide Year 11s through essay writing for NCEA Level 1, specifically individual paragraphs and their structure relevant to poetry. So it's really important that if you're doing this lesson that you are taking notes in the right place. If you don't think you are, or if you're not sure if you're taking notes in the right place, you need to go back to the Teams post and read it carefully. You'll notice during this lesson that there will be this symbol coming up regularly. If you see that symbol on a slide, it means that you need to copy the notes on that slideshow because they are important for you to take. Okay. There will also be some highlighting. It's important that you copy the highlighting exactly as well because those notes will help you with the task that you are going to do. So this spell's going to look at what exactly is an essay. We're going to go through the SEXC structure, which you might be familiar with or you might not. That's the structure for paragraphs. We're going to look at an example and you are going to learn about what you have to do for the next week. So what is an essay exactly? Now you'll notice the symbol up the top here, so it means you need to write down this slide. An essay in English, because you'll write essays in other subjects, an essay in English is an argument that you form about a text using evidence to prove yourself right. So a text could be a poem, a short story, a novel, or a film. So it's an argument that you saying this is what the poem is about. That's what an essay is. In the exam, you respond to essay questions. We're going to go through this later on in the year, but you'll sit down in the exam and you will have a list of about 8 questions to choose from, and you need to answer one of those questions in an essay form. So, for example, a past essay question has been describe and explain how language is used to portray a message in the written text. So we will talk about this later in the year, but the question is what guides your essay writing. But we're not going to worry about that just yet because we're going to focus on structure first. So in the English exam, which is at the end of the year, you will most likely write 2 essays in 3 hours. So the exam is 3 hours long, and you will most likely write 2 essays. One of those essays will either be on the poetry that we've studied, so Past, Future and A Negro Speaks of Rivers, or the novel that we study in Term 3. And you will most likely also write an essay on the film that we study, which is what we're studying next term. This seems like a lot, but we do lots of practice during the year, and then you are very well prepared for when you sit down in the exam. But it takes practice, which is what this task is for. So why exactly do you have to write essays? So for NCEA English, NZQA have decided that an essay is the best way to show that you can identify an idea in a text, you can find evidence, so find quotes, analyze that evidence, so unpack it, asking what, how, why, and explain the purpose behind the text. So all of those things are needed to show an understanding of literature. So if you write an essay, you're doing all of those things, which shows you understand literature. And the more depth that you show in your understanding, so the more developed your essay, the better your grade is going to be, achieved merit or excellence. And I'm going to explain that as well as we go on. So what exactly is the SEXC? It's an acronym for the structure of paragraphs for an essay. So you've got the symbol in the right-hand corner, so you need to write down these notes. This is what it stands for, SEXC, statement, explanation, example, comment. So these are the 4 parts of an essay paragraph. You might have had different acronyms used in different schools or last year. It's all the same thing, okay? It's all basically the same. Statement, explanation, example, comment, SEXC. So specifically for a whole essay, an essay has an introduction, 3 sexy paragraphs and a conclusion. Okay, so what we're looking at today is just the structure of one paragraph. Okay, but an entire essay has 3 sexy paragraphs and it starts with an introduction and ends in a conclusion. These word counts are just a suggestion. It's not that you have to write that much or that little, but that's generally how long a level 1 English essay is. So let's unpack this SEXC acronym. So you'll notice the symbols in the right hand corner, so you need to write this down and make sure you're doing the highlighting as well. So S stands for statement. It's the first line of a paragraph. It's the first sentence that you write in a paragraph. It's a judgment statement. So we've been writing judgment statements this term for both poems, Past, Future, and A Negro Speaks of Rivers. So a judgment statement is what you use as the first line of a paragraph. And it uses a key idea, which we already know. We know a judgment statement is you saying, this is what idea is in the poem, this is what it's about. So the statement, the S, the statement for a paragraph is a judgment statement that addresses either cultural identity or cultural dislocation. So let's look at an example of that. Now you don't have to write down the example. See, there's no symbol, so you don't have to write the example down because you're going to get a copy of it later. So here's an example statement. Langston Hughes's A Negro Speaks of Rivers shows the idea that cultural identity can be strengthened over time. So this is what the poem teaches us about cultural identity. That is a statement. It's one sentence. So next up is the E, the explanation. So you'll notice the symbol. You need to copy this down and make sure you do the highlighting as well. So the explanation part of the paragraph is just one sentence, just explaining the poem and your judgment statement in a little more detail. So it just means that you just give a little more context for what you're trying to say. Okay, so make sure you've done the highlighting here. So for example, in the poem, the speaker describes how he has been removed from his homeland and history over time, but he still feels connected to his roots. Okay, so it's just you in one sentence explaining what the poem is about, because you need to remember that when you sit down in the exam, the person who's reading your essay, when they mark it, might not necessarily have read the poem. So you need to give a little bit of explanation as to what the poem is about. So that's the E. Next is the X, standing for example. So statement, explanation, example. So this is where you provide a quote from the text and state what language technique is being used. It's really important that you specifically label the technique that's being used. So the quote that you choose, the evidence that you pull out from the poem should prove the statement. Okay, we've talked about this before, that the evidence that you use can't just be random. It has to make sense for the idea that you're trying to prove. And then when you've given the quote and you've explained the language technique, you follow the what, how, why formula to unpack that quote. So we've done all of this in class. It's just about putting it all together. So, for example, remember you don't have to write down this example because you're going to get it soon. But let's say, my soul has grown deep like the rivers is my quote, and I know it's a simile, and I've got the what, how, why. Okay, I am not going to read that out because this is already in your notes. You already have that what, how, why. But this is just an explanation of that to show what it looks like, to remind you what the what, how, why is. And you'll notice the pieces that are underlined. You can use that language. You can use those starters if you want to. And finally, C stands for comment. And this is where you explain the relevance of the poem and what we learn from it. So no longer are you talking about language, techniques, you're talking about the ideas and what we're supposed to take away. So what the author would want us to learn from the poem. So it's also known as the author's purpose and the reader response. So the purpose for the author and the way the reader responds. And obviously, because this is one paragraph, the comment needs to relate to your statement and the example. So it all has to connect back together. It all has to make sense. So remember, you don't have to write down the example, but just to show you, the author's purpose, Hughes's communication of this important message in this poem is a powerful expression of the impact of cultural dislocation on the African American people. He shows us that although his people have experienced centuries of oppression, they have adapted and developed a new identity that represents who they are as a collective. So this is me explaining, I think this is what Langston Hughes is trying to do with this poem. And you'll notice I've underlined identity because the original idea I was looking at was cultural identity. So I'm still drawing back to the statement. And then on from that is the reader response. So this is what Langston Hughes is trying to tell us. How are we supposed to feel? What do we learn? Hughes encourages the reader to admire African American history and marvel at the strength of his people. We feel a mix of sorrow for their loss of connection to their homeland, but also hope for the future that they will continue to grow in strength as they have done in the past, despite slavery, segregation, and racism. We feel the same pride he does for his people and learn that oppression can be fought against if cultural identity is strong. So I'm responding to what I've said in the author's purpose. This is what Hughes has done with the poem. This is how we respond as readers. And again, I've linked back to the key idea of cultural identity. So this is what it looks like in full, right? We've got the statement, which is a judgment statement. We have the explanation, which is where you explain it. The example in blue, so that's where you give a quote, the technique, and the what, how, why. And then the comment in pink, the author's purpose and the reader response. So on the next slide is an example paragraph of everything put together, which is why you didn't have to write down the example. So this is what a full SEXC paragraph looks like. Now you have this in your assignment document, so you need to go to that assignment document and highlight it correctly with the right part. So Langston Hughes' A Negro Speaks of Rivers shows the idea that cultural identity can be strengthened over time. In the poem, the speaker describes how he has been removed from his homeland and history over time, but he still feels connected to his roots. An example from the poem that shows this is "My soul has grown deep like the rivers." This quote shows how African American people have strength in their own culture. The use of a simile compares his soul to a river. Rivers are strong, deep, and immovable, so he is saying that his soul and spirit have the same qualities. This is important because Langston Hughes is telling us that the African American culture is strong. He feels secure and connected to his cultural identity because of this. Langston Hughes helps the reader to realize that even though African American people were dislocated from their history and culture due to slavery, they have been able to build a new cultural identity that is strong and resilient. He is drawing our attention to his pride in his identity. Hughes's communication of this important message in this poem is a powerful expression of the impact of cultural dislocation on the African American people. He shows us that although his people have experienced centuries of oppression, they have adapted and developed a new identity that represents who they are as a collective. Hughes encourages the reader to admire African American history and marvel at the strength of his people. We feel a mix of sorrow for their loss of connection to their homeland, but also hope for the future that they will continue to grow in strength as they have done in the past despite slavery, segregation, and racism. We feel the same pride he does for his people and learn that oppression can be fought against if cultural identity is strong. So that is one sexy paragraph for an essay. Remember, an essay has 3 paragraphs. This is 1. It's got the statement in yellow, the explanation in green, the example in blue, and the comment in pink. And this is about the expected length. Okay, you'll notice that the blue and the pink are around the same length. That's really important, okay? Because giving the evidence really matters, because that shows you can unpack language, but the pink is important as well because that's your more deeper understanding of what the author's trying to do, what the purpose of the text is, and that's really important as well. So this is your task. Now these details are on your assignment document as well. Your assignment is to write 1 sexy paragraph on a poem of your choice, either A Negro Speaks of Rivers or Past Future. It's entirely up to you which poem you choose, but you need to write 1 sexy paragraph for either of those 2 poems. And you need to use one of the key ideas that we've looked at in class, because that's what we've focused on. So you're either going to talk about cultural identity or you're going to talk about cultural dislocation, and either of those will come up in your judgment statement. So you need to write this paragraph on the team's assignment that's set up for you. That's really important that you put it there. Okay? That's really important that you put it there because that's where I can see it. You will also notice in the assignment document that there's a planner. That's optional. So you can use the planner if you want to help you get used to the structure, or you can skip that and go straight to your paragraph. It's up to you. So, important stuff. The due date for this paragraph is Friday the 25th of March at the end of spell 1. So in total, you get 4 class spells, not including today, to do this work. And I'm going to mark it, and it's what your first term's report is going to be on. So this is to give you your first indication of how you're working at NCEA Level 1. If you're looking for an extension, if you want to do a little bit more, you can do 2 paragraphs, 1 on A Negro Speaks of Rivers and 1 on Past Future. Okay, so 2 paragraphs shows me a stronger understanding if you want to push yourself a little bit. And it is important that you do as well as you can. I'm not expecting perfect work for this task. I'm expecting you to give it a go so I can get an accurate picture of where you're working at the moment, how well you've understood what we've done in class. So you can use all of the notes from class that you have. That's why we took them. Make sure you use your A3 analysis sheets for the poem that you choose, because that's where all the evidence is. So the notes that you've taken, the work that you've done, use those for this because that's what they are for.